When I was 18, I came home to an empty house and a single note on the kitchen counter that said, "You'll figure it out." No explanation, no goodbye, just silence and the echo of my own heartbeat. I slept in a storage unit that winter, ate peanut butter with a spoon, and taught myself how to survive. 13 years later, I did more than survive. I built a company from nothing, hit 7 figures, and thought I'd finally left the past behind. Then one morning, my inbox lit up with 3 words I never expected to see again. "We miss you." My parents, the same people who abandoned me, wanted back, and not for love, but for money, so I took them to court. Before I share everything that happened, I'd love to know you're here with me. Just say hi in the comments or tell me where you're from. I love seeing how far my story can reach. Sometimes knowing someone is out there listening makes all the difference. Thank you. And now let me tell you everything. If my story hits something in you, please subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know, and maybe together we can remind the world that walking away from the people who broke you isn't cruelty, it's survival. My name is Ethan Walker, and this is how I learned to stop calling blood family. The first thing I noticed was the flicker over the sink. That tired tube light stuttering like it couldn't make up its mind about living. The second was the refrigerator door yawning open on an empty shelf. That soft motor hum pushing cold into a room that didn't need it. The third was the note. It sat alone on the chipped Formica edges, curling from the damp 3 words written in my mother's careful grocery list hand. "You'll figure it out." No explanation, no goodbye. Somewhere beyond the thin walls, a freight train blew its horn, and the sound dragged through the kitchen like a long, low scrape. Rain hit the window in sideways sheets, neon from the liquor store across the street melting pink and blue across the tile. I stood there with my backpack still on and my jacket dripping onto the floor and waited for the punchline that didn't come. The place looked vacuumed clean of us. No bills on the corkboard, no shoes by the door, no dented saucepan on the stove. The file drawer in the hall was yanked out and empty, the hangers in the closet swinging like metronomes. I dialed my mother. Nothing my father. Straight to voicemail. Ryan, my little brother. The call failed and failed again. When I checked the mailbox on the way back up, final notices spilled like paper ribs, gas water. A cable bill with my name on it and theirs torn off at the perforation. At the bottom of the pile was an envelope from the county assistant's office addressed to Linda Walker. Inside a copy of a benefits application dated 6 months earlier. Household size 2. Names listed Linda and Frank. No me, no Ryan, just them. A small box ticked single dependents, not in household. I read that line 5 times before I felt it land. Planning, not panic, not some last-minute scramble. Planning. I went room to room anyway because denial has muscle memory. In their bedroom, a rectangle of dust on the dresser where the TV had been. In Ryan's room, the blank imprint of his mattress, a little galaxy of pushpin holes in the wall where his posters had been. In mine, the drawer with the loose rail that always stuck. I pulled it open and found the last things they hadn't bothered to take because they weren't worth anything. My beat-to-hell running shoes with a flapping sole, a stainless watch with a cracked crystal that used to be my grandfather's, and a photo of the 4 of us in front of a roadside dinosaur in Arizona. My mother's hand on my shoulder, my father squinting against the sun, Ryan making rabbit ears behind my head. The watch ticked in an uneven way like it was arguing with time. I put it in my pocket anyway, on the back of the note. When I lifted it toward the light, I caught it an impression like a bruise, the faint carbon shadow of another paper pressed hard against it. At some point, I-10 fuel stop timestamp from earlier that evening. Initials scrolled in my father's blocky print. They'd filled up on the interstate while I was on shift, then drove east without me. I pressed my thumb to the words because I didn't know what else to touch. The landlord lived 2 doors down. He opened in his socks, looked past my shoulder into the hollowed-out unit, and shrugged. That practiced landlord shrug. "They paid out the lease in cash last week," he said like he was telling me the weather. "Keys. Due Friday." Memphis, he thought. They'd mentioned Memphis. He handed me a generic move-out checklist and apologized to his shoes. Back in the kitchen, I spread everything I had onto the form mica, like evidence. The note. The assistants formed, the stack of bills, the gas imprint. I found a lined composition book in my backpack from Algebra 2 and wrote on the first page in block letters, "Survival." Under it, I made a list. Eat, sleep, phone, work, shelter. Tomorrow I would ask Sam at the diner for more hours. Tonight, there was nothing to do but stay. I rolled my hoodie into a pillow, curled on the linoleum under the flicker as the fridge breathed on me, and the train sounded again. And I tried not to think about the space my body used to take up in this place, and how easily the room had learned to do without it. Sometime after midnight, I woke to rain in the light well, and the neon shutting off with a pop. I stared up at the ceiling until it was morning, until the weak gray came in, and I felt the decision settle the way cold settles into bone. I took the note and slid it into my wallet behind my ID. If they were right, if I was going to figure it out, then I would, but it wouldn't look like anything they ever imagined. At the storage facility off the interstate, the clerk didn't ask why a 18-year-old needed a 8x10. He just handed me a brass key and a cut-prick padlock and told me the hallway lights were on a motion sensor. The unit smelled like dust and motor oil. And when I pulled the door down, the corrugated metal boomed like a drum and then went still. On the concrete, I spread my jacket like a blanket, set the watch next to my head so I could hear its stubborn tick, and opened the composition book to page 2. Budget. I wrote food. $6 day shower, community rec center job, Silver Spoon Diner. To the right, I drew a box around keep every receipt. The fridge door in my memory swung shut on a ghost of cold, and I felt the room I'd slept in last night vanishing for good, like a door on a moving train finally closing. In the dim, I traced the pressure mark of the fuel receipt in my mind until it became a map. I didn't know yet what it would lead to, only that I wouldn't throw it away. Summer in Wichita. Kansas comes at you sideways. Heat finds the seams of everything and pry them open. The tar in the parking lot softens the air between buildings, tastes like pennies, and even the simplest smells, grease-wet paper, stick to your skin. Days bled together. The unit, the community rec center shower at 6:30 a.m., the long walk to the Silver Spoon on Highway 54, the hiss of the flat top, the bell above the door, the midnight lull when your feet go numb, and the coffee tastes like pennies, too. Sam. My manager watched me mop with the handle tucked into my armpit and said, "Kid, get 25 minutes," and tilted his chin toward the break room. He paid me in cash until I could get proper ID, a folded stack that felt heavier than it was, plus a sandwich wrapped tight and a lecture about not dying on his watch. In the margins, I started building a system. Every receipt went into a cheap zip bag in my pocket. The composition book grew, columns date, vendor amount, need, want. Under the heading goals, I wrote a 100-day plan like I'd seen in some free YouTube video at the public library, 1 state ID. 2 bank account, 3 emergency fund, $1 and $200. I drew a checkbox next to each and left them blank because blank boxes have a way of pulling you forward. Nights after the bar, rush a man with a shaved head and soft hands sat at the far booth with meatloaf and a ledger. He tipped 18% in cash and never sent food back. One night he asked if I knew how to alphabetize. I can learn, I said, which turned out to be the right answer. Mr. Adler ran a logistics office out by the rail yard and needed someone to clear a decade of paper ghosts. The job paid triple my nightly take in tips. On my first day, He showed me a room that smelled like a library drowned in coffee bankers' boxes stacked to eye level, and each labeled in a handwriting war between 3 different employees. We started with A, and by lunch I knew I'd underestimated the weight of paper. By the end of the week I had calloused thumbs and a sense that I could make chaos kneel if I gave it a rule. You're quick. Mr. Adler said not like a compliment, but like a fact he was adding to a ledger. He slid a second task across the desk. Transpose purchase orders to a spreadsheet. You know Excel. I said the thing that had worked before I can learn. The public library became my classroom. I watched strangers on grainy videos turn numbers into meaning and formulas into little machines that did what you told them. Some lookup conditional formatting. I built my first dashboard on a hand-me-down laptop. The office let me borrow colored cells turning red when a deadline slipped. It felt like a secret door opening onto a room no one had told me existed. On payday, I stopped at a strip mall store and bought a prepaid phone. Gray plastic and heavier than it looked. I programmed 3 numbers: the diner, the logistics office, the community rec center desk. In the parking lot, I drew a box around the first goal in my notebook and checked it off. Idaho Card's stock ID would come later. For now, a state temporary would get me a bank account. The teller looked at me like a riddle she didn't have time to solve. Minimum deposit, I counted out tips and Halpern's cash and slid them under the glass. On the walk back, I realized I was standing taller. It wasn't pride. It was infrastructure. The twist with Mr. Adler revealed itself the way a curtain does when air conditioning kicks on. One afternoon, he left his email open while he went to the copy room. The subject line at the top of the inbox read, "Read your message." And under it, a thread that didn't belong to invoices. His sister had written about his daughter estranged the word used like a diagnosis. They hadn't spoken in years. I saw a kid at the diner. One of his earlier replies said, 18 hungry fast. I can at least be the person I wish someone had been for me. When he came back, he didn't pretend I hadn't seen it. He put a stapler down on the desk between us and said, "Everyone needs a clean ledger someday." And the conversation folded itself shut. After that, when he gave me harder work standardizing file names, building an intake sheet, mapping a process on a whiteboard, he did it like he wasn't testing me but assuming I would get there. The other twist sat waiting for me like a landmine in a shoebox. The landlord had given me until Friday to turn in the Wichita, Kansas keys, so I took one last trip to the apartment to scrub what was left of my name off the place. In the back of a kitchen drawer, a wad of receipts had swollen from the humidity. Most were junk lotto tickets, gas station gum, a coupon for windshield wipers. In the middle was a bank transfer slip with my father's name in blue ink. Frank Walker transferred $250 to Ryan Walker. Memo long drive dated the week they'd left. The handwriting was my father's. Those angular letters like he'd carved them with a pocket knife. I laughed once, a sound with no humor in it. And then I took the slip and put it in the zip bag with my other receipts. Narratives like to rearrange themselves over time. Evidence keeps them honest. By July, the heat leaned harder, and the Silver Spoon swamp cooler coughed more than it cooled. And still the routine made a shape I could live inside: unit shower diner office library unit. Sam timed my 25-minute nap with his phone and shook my shoulder like a big brother who didn't want to admit it. Mr. Adler handed me a cheap mechanical pencil and told me good work lives in the margin notes. At night, I'd sit on the storage unit floor and run the week's numbers. The 65-25-10 budget I'd copied from a free video got translated into my version 65 to needs until the emergency fund hit $1,200, $25 to transit, and work costs 10 to wants, which often rounded to 0. I put a star next to every day I didn't spend cash I didn't have. The composition book grew heavier with ink and grease. When the emergency fund crossed $360, I circled it twice. At $720, I wrote the number on a Post-it and stuck it to the inside of the unit door so I'd see it when I left at dawn. The nights were still long. Loneliness is a kind of weather, and some evenings it rolled in no matter what systems I built. I kept the watch by my head, the broken crystal-catching hallway light when someone walked past and triggered the motion sensor, the tick reminding me that even damaged things keep time. On Thursday of week 11, I made the last entry of the night and flipped back to page 1. Survival, the first line said. Below it, the list that had seemed impossible now looked like a recipe I'd learned by heart. Eat, sleep, phone work, shelter. I added a new header scale. Next to it, I wrote 3 words that didn't feel like mine yet, but might if I kept at it. Leave. Wichita year. I drew a thick line under the sentence so the ink bled a little into the paper fibers. Then I closed the book, and for the first time since the kitchen and the note, and the open fridge and the flicker, I believed I could. The desk was a foldable one from a clearance sale, its metal legs wobbling whenever I leaned too hard. The chair was borrowed from a diner supply room, the kind with a tear in the vinyl seat and the smell of old coffee trapped in its foam. That was my office, Austin 1-bedroom. No air conditioning that summer, but it didn't matter. I had a borrowed laptop, a prepaid phone, and 3 clients who were willing to pay only if my work saved them money. I called it Northline Consulting because it sounded bigger than it was. Most days I was the company's sales strategy cleanup crew janitor. The first client was a small automotive parts warehouse near Round Rock, Texas, drowning in paper trails and unpaid invoices. I streamlined their reorder process using Excel sheets I'd built from YouTube tutorials, the same ones I'd learned in Wichita. When the owner wired payment $400 more than I expected, I stared at the screen long enough for the confirmation email to refresh twice. The next week, another job came, then another. By winter, I was tracking 6 clients at once. My desk bowed under the weight of receipts, and my notebook filled with margins of formula notes. 2 years later, I moved north. Seattle offered clearer air, fewer memories. I rented a 1-room apartment on the 12th floor of a glass building where every sunset turned the mountains pink. The city felt sterile but safe. I paid for a seat in a co-working space downtown, my name printed on a shared mailbox that made me look legitimate. From there, Northline expanded 6 contractors, remote workers I'd never met but trusted because I had no choice. We optimized small business operations, rebuilt inventory systems, fixed mistakes others charged too much to fix. I charged only after results came in. It built loyalty. It also built a reputation. By 28, I had no debt, and my retirement account existed small but real. At 30, the banking app showed 7 figures for the first time. I closed the laptop and sat in silence. The sound of the city was far below me. Tiny sirens and wind. I didn't cry out of joy, just out of exhaustion. It was the first quiet I'd earned. Dr. Megan Rhodes entered my life not through crisis, but through curiosity. A therapist recommended by a podcast guest, she specialized in adult survivors of parental abandonment. Her office had wide windows and too many plants. She asked about the note on the counter, about the watch, about how success felt. I told her it felt like scaffolding, useful, temporary, always at risk of being dismantled. She nodded and said, "That's a start." Between work trips, I audited my company's online footprint, SEO, mentions, reviews. That was when I found her, my mother. A public post from 3 years earlier, a grainy photo of me at 18 captioned, "Please pray for our lost son. He took money and ran away. We just want him safe." There were hundreds of sympathetic comments. Poor parents' kids these days. My chest hollowed out like someone had removed the air from it. They'd been rewriting me for years. Further down, a church newsletter surfaced in a cached search result. Special thanks to the Walker family for their tireless efforts to find their runaway son. It was dated the same month I'd been sleeping in the storage unit. I downloaded the PDF, timestamped it, and saved it to a folder called History. There was no rage, only a cold precision. The story they built had kept them clean. The silence I kept had made it possible. I grew the company anyway. I learned to automate systems to hire without attachment. Work became the language I could speak without risk. Nights in Seattle were colder, the air so thin it felt new in my lungs. Sometimes I'd watch the mountains fade into cloud and think of the boy sleeping on concrete with a ticking watch beside his head. The world believed he'd run away. He knew he'd been left behind. On the last night of the fiscal year, I closed the book, saved the files, and looked around my quiet apartment. The city blinked back at me through the glass, small, bright, and distant. I reached into my wallet, unfolded the note I'd carried for 13 years. The ink was fading, the edges worn soft from friction, but the words were still there. "You'll figure it out." I placed it beside the monitor and whispered, "I did just not the way you meant." Then I put it back where it would wait, a silent witness to everything they never thought I could become. If they ever came back, I told myself I'd be ready. I just didn't know that readiness and peace were not the same thing. Autumn in Seattle felt like glass, clear, cold, and brittle. The air from the mountains slipped through the narrow window of my apartment and made the edges of everything sharper. I had just finished editing a podcast episode called Life Beyond Blood, a conversation about chosen families and boundaries. The episode went viral overnight. My inbox filled with stories from strangers, people who'd survived the same quiet cruelty. And buried between their messages were two names I hadn't seen in 13 years. The first email was titled, "You're Still Our Son, Mom." The message was short. "You've been through enough. I'm ready to listen for once." No apology, no explanation, just that familiar voice wearing kindness like a mask. I read it 3 times, tracing the reflection of the phrase, "our son," in the dark glass of my screen. I didn't respond. I forwarded it to a new folder labeled Walker Correspondence and shut the laptop. An hour later came the second email, this time from Ryan. "I miss you. We can fix this." My hand hovered over the reply button before I stopped. I sent it to Dr. Megan Rhodes instead. She called me within minutes, her voice calm. "Do nothing for a week," she said. "Your first reaction will always belong to the past, not the present." I tried to follow her advice. I went to the gym, took client calls, ate dinner with a coworker. But at night, the emails sat behind my eyelids like neon. I'd open them, close them, open them again. Each line was shaped like sincerity, but smelled like paperwork. The tone was too clean, too coordinated. Families don't write like that unless they've rehearsed. On the 8th day, another message arrived from my mother. This one had attachments, dozens of old photos I thought were gone. Me at 5 on the beach. Me holding a sparkler. Us baking cookies. All smiles. All warm light. At the bottom, she wrote, "We all make mistakes. Let's start again." For a moment, I almost believed it. Then habit kicked in. I checked the file data. The photos weren't scanned. They'd been digitally edited 3 days earlier. The metadata showed brightness adjustments, smoothing filters, fake timestamps. The past had been retouched for effect. I stared at the folder until the images blurred. Memory had always been my soft spot, and she knew it. The manipulation wasn't careless. It was strategy. They wanted to script a reunion to control how it looked if I ever spoke out. That evening, a message from Ryan followed. "Mom's worried. Dad lost his job. Things are harder than ever." "No, sorry. No, we're proud of you." Just a faint tilt toward money dressed in concern. I read it twice, printed it, and wrote the time in the corner. I was done deleting history. Later, I sat at my desk, Seattle lights glowing below like spilled coins. I opened my therapy journal and wrote, "I can't tell if I'm supposed to feel pity or self-defense." Beneath it, another line. "They always return when there's something to take." Before bed, one more message appeared. It had been sent by accident, a document labeled Medical Statement PDF. The page showed an unpaid hospital bill under my father's name. At the bottom, the guarantor was listed as R. Walker. Ryan was carrying their debt. The realization dropped into me like a stone. They were using him the way they'd once used me. Different target, same play. I shut the computer, turned off the lights, and sat in the dark long enough for my eyes to adjust. Somewhere below, a siren wailed long and distant, the same kind of sound I used to fall asleep to in Wichita. I imagined my mother curating photos, my father silent beside her, Ryan typing out messages he didn't believe in. The city outside kept moving. Inside, I wrote an answer I didn't send. It's been 13 years. What makes you think you can come back now? I watched the cursor blink like a heartbeat, then hit save instead of send. The past had finally knocked again, and I wasn't sure if I was strong enough or cold enough to open the door. Minneapolis was a compromise halfway between the lives we'd built without each other. Rain needled the river and smeared the glass. I got to Blueprint Cafe early and took the table by the window, the one where you can see yourself superimposed over the street like a ghost. My hands wouldn't stop trembling, so I anchored them around a cup I didn't plan to drink. When Ryan walked in, he scanned the room the way people do when they hope they're wrong. He'd filled out. His hairline had started the slow retreat our father used to joke about. He saw me and stopped as if he'd reached a ledge. We didn't hug. We nodded and sat. For 20 minutes we did weather and flights, and the price of parking two strangers using small talk as a splint. I watched how he held his cup, how his knee bounced under the table, how his eyes kept slipping off mine. Finally, I asked what I came to ask. Why did you leave me without a word? He stared into the coffee like it could save him. They thought you were okay, he said. You were always the strong one. I was 15. I didn't know how to fight them. I told him about the storage unit, about sleeping on concrete with a jacket for a blanket, about spoonfuls of peanut butter and showers at the community rec center before the diner shift. His mouth opened and didn't make a sound. They told me you stayed with a friend, he said. They said you had a plan and wanted to finish school there. That's what we all believed. I felt the old kitchen rise up in me, the flicker, the open fridge, the note, and wondered how many versions of me they had written to survive their own story. When I mentioned our mother, his gaze slid to the window. Things are bad, he said. Dad's out of work, medical bills. I'm carrying what I can. If you could help even a little, it would. He didn't finish. It sat between us like an unpaid invoice. I pushed my chair back. The scrape on the concrete floor sounded too loud. I didn't come here to talk about money, I said. He touched my sleeve, a reflex from childhood. Wait the podcast. You don't know what it's done. People at their church, their neighbors, they're talking. They might sue you for defamation. Can they sue the truth, I asked. He flinched. The rain knocked at the glass. We stood to leave at the same time and collided in a clumsy half-embrace that neither of us completed. He reached into his coat and handed me a small envelope. They wanted you to read this. I didn't open it until I was back in the hotel with the highway whispering from the vent. Inside was a page that looked too familiar. The same slope of our mother's handwriting. The same cheap stationery. You'll figure it out. We always knew you would. And beneath it, in darker ink that hadn't existed 13 years ago. Now help us. I held the paper to the light until the fibers showed. Somewhere in my chest, a door I thought I'd locked rattled on its hinges. I put the letter on the desk beside my wallet where the original lived old ink next to new, and studied the distance between the two sentences that had tried to define my life. The city kept raining. I wrote a single line in my notebook before sleep finally took me. If they think I'll return because of blood, they never learned who I became without them. In the morning, MSP was a blur of rolling suitcases and announcements. On the plane, I watched the wing cut through the clouds and rehearsed the conversation. I would not have. By the time Seattle's skyline came into view, my heartbeat had slowed. The mountains waited indifferent and solid. I landed to a text from Dr. Megan Rhodes. How did it go? And typed. I told her the truth. He offered me a bill and left it at that. The first bouquet was waiting when I got home from therapy, propped against my door like a good deed. White lies, a smell like hospitals. The card read, "We're proud of you, son." No name. The hallway camera blinked red in the ceiling. I carried the flowers down to the dumpster and watched them disappear under cardboard and coffee grounds, then told the front desk not to accept anything without a sender. The concierge nodded with the practiced sympathy of someone who'd seen too much of other people's families. At sunrise, an email from Ryan arrived as if on cue. "Heard someone sent you flowers. Mom, you didn't need to be harsh to be." I stared at the screen until the message went soft. The only way he could know was if someone inside the building had told them, or if they were close enough to watch. I closed the laptop and stood at the window until the city sharpened into day. That night, I was working through vendor redundancies when 3 hard knocks landed on my door, measured and deliberate. I looked through the peephole. A man and a woman in heavy coats stood there, the bouquet's twin balanced in their arms. I switched off the lights and stepped back until my shoulders touched the kitchen cabinets. They waited the way people do when they think persistence is love. After 10 minutes, they left the elevator, swallowing them whole. I didn't turn the lights on for a long time. In the morning, the front desk called. "Your parents came by," the guard said quietly, as if he were telling me a secret. "They said they wanted to surprise you." I asked him what he'd told them, that you weren't receiving visitors. "They waited in the parking lot for 2 hours. I said, "Thank you," and heard my own voice flatten. That evening my phone lit with a number I didn't recognize. I knew the cadence before she spoke. Her voice came through wet with tears. "I had a scare last week," she said. "Heart trouble. We've made mistakes. I've made mistakes. I just want to hold my son." Guilt is an old chord. It remembers every note. I let her talk until she ran out of words and then asked the only question that mattered. "Why 13 years of silence?" There was a pause. "Because we needed time for you to understand," she said. The line hummed like the old refrigerator. I told her not to call again and hung up with my hand shaking. Minutes later, another email pinged. No subject, a single attachment. When I opened it, my own face looked back at me, blurred at the edges by motion, my body mid-stride on the sidewalk outside my building, the angle from across the street. In the background, the lobby lights burned like small moons. I saved the image as if it were a receipt printed. It wrote the date and time in the margin and sent it to Evan Cho with a short note. "This is escalating." He called me before the printer finished spooling. "Document everything he said. Keep the packaging from the flowers if you still have it. File a report with building security so we have a record. Do not engage. If they appear at the door again, call 911. Say you have an active safety concern and use those exact words." His voice was steady the way bridges are steady. Snow came at the end of the week, a powder that softened the city's edges and made the air burn a little in my lungs. I kept the apartment dark at night and worked by the light of my screen, and the blue glow reflecting off the window like a second sky. The photo sat on my desk beside the letter from Minneapolis and the original note from the kitchen. Old story, new story, and proof that both were still trying to own me. I set up a folder on my desktop labeled Legal and inside it, another labeled Evidence Family. I dragged the images and emails in and felt an odd, bureaucratic calm. Paper had saved me once before. It could save me again. On Sunday, I walked to the corner for groceries and thought I saw the shape of my father's profile in a sedan idling across the street. The same squared jaw, the same ball cap pulled low. When I blinked, it was only a stranger. Or maybe it wasn't. The truth is that fear wears ordinary faces. That night, when the building was quiet and even the elevators seemed to sleep, I opened the windows a crack and let the cold in. The city moved under me like a slow river. Somewhere a siren rose and fell. I placed the phone face down, turned the note in my wallet over in my palm until the paper warmed, and said aloud to the empty room, "I see you." Not to them. To the part of me that still felt 18 and small. The lily smell had faded, but the idea of them lingered. I closed the window, checked the lock, and made a new list in the notebook that had once been titled Survival. At the top, I wrote a word I hadn't let myself write before protection. Under it, 3 lines: police report, building log restraining order. Then I dated the page, and before sleep came, I drew a box next to each line, neat and square, the way you do when you're certain you'll be able to check them. The call came before dawn when the sky was still the color of cold metal. My phone buzzed across the nightstand until I answered. Ryan's voice cracked on the first word. "They broke in," he said. "The doors splintered. Laptops gone. Emma's baby photos too. They left a note." I sat up, pulse hammering. What kind of note? There was a pause. The sound of him trying not to cry. It says, "Family matters. Stay in the family." I was already getting dressed before the line went dead. The drive from Seattle to Tacoma took less than 2 hours, but it felt longer. The rain followed me down I-5, slicking the road in streaks of silver. When I pulled into their driveway, 2 police cruisers were parked outside, lights off, but doors open. Ryan stood in the doorway, his hands trembling against his jeans. The front door hung crooked on its frame. Inside smelled like wet carpet and fear. A uniformed officer walked me through the room, speaking in the monotone of paperwork. "Could have been random," he said. "Sometimes thieves leave weird notes." On the kitchen table, I saw the photo, our family 2005, that staged summer at the lake. It had been torn clean down the middle, my face gone, everyone else intact. I slipped it into a plastic sleeve and sealed it. Evan Cho arrived 2 hours later, suit immaculate even in the rain. He surveyed the damage, spoke quietly to the officers, then turned to me. "We treat this as evidence, not tragedy," he said. "You understand?" I nodded. He made a few calls, one of them to Detective Jamie O'Neill in Seattle, a woman he trusted, someone who owed him a favor. "She's good with family-related threats," he said. "And she knows how to find people who think they can't be found." While we waited, Nina packed Emma's toys into a box. Her movements sharp and efficient, the way people move when they're afraid to stop. Ryan sat on the couch, head in his hands. "They still have access," he said suddenly. "To what I asked." He opened his banking app and turned the screen toward me. There was a withdrawal, $6,000, signed digitally under our father's name. "That account's been mine since college," he whispered. "I never changed the credentials." By the time O'Neill arrived, the rain had turned to sleet. She moved through the rooms with quiet precision, photographing, measuring. "We'll pull street footage," she said. "See what kind of car they drove." 3 hours later, she founded a grainy frame from a neighbor's security camera. A dark Buick, early 2000s model, the same kind my father used to drive, plates half visible but legible enough for cross-reference. She sent it to Evan with a dry note. "Tell your clients to lock everything. They're not done." We were still in the house when the landline rang, an old corded phone that Ryan had kept for his home office. He hesitated before answering. The voice that came through was cold and familiar. "If you drag family business into the police station, my mother said there will be nothing left to talk about." Her tone wasn't angry, just final. Ryan stared at the receiver as if it might burn him. "You're being recorded," he said quietly, then hung up. Evan Cho looked at me. "That's the sound of leverage," he said. "Now we have proof." He called in a transcription service to preserve the voicemail, logged the call time, and added it to the growing file labeled Walker Restraining Order Petition. When we left, the door had been replaced with plywood, the smell of rain and sawdust clinging to everything. On the porch, Ryan asked if we were overreacting. I pointed at the broken lock. "You still think this is about guilt?" I said. "This is control. Always has been." He nodded, eyes red. I kept thinking they'd stop if I explained enough. He said that if I just helped them. I touched his shoulder. They don't stop. They escalate. Before leaving, I watched the crime scene tape flutter in the wind. The yellow strip stretched across the doorway looked too thin to separate one life from another, but it was all we had. "We'll file everything by morning," Evan said. 3 restraining orders, full coverage." I signed the authorization on his tablet, the digital pen shaking slightly in my hand. When I looked back at the house one last time, the porch light flickered, catching the wet pavement like a signal. "We're not their children anymore," I told Ryan. "We're the evidence they can't erase." Monday in Seattle was the color of old paper, gray dry and humming with static. The courthouse steps were slick with melted snow. I stood between Evan and Ryan, our breath visible in the cold. Inside, the air smelled like coffee and disinfectant. People whispered, curious about the family whose podcast had gone viral and now stood in front of a judge. Judge Denise Harper presided, a woman with sharp eyes and no patience for sentiment. "Let's proceed," she said. Evan rose first, calm as ever. "Your Honor," he began, "this is not about reconciliation. This is about protection." He presented the evidence one by one. The photos of the bouquets, the surveillance picture of me outside my building, the torn family photo from Tacoma, the voicemail transcript, the bank withdrawal under my father's name, and the still frame of the Buick idling near Ryan's driveway. The list sounded mechanical, but each exhibit carried 13 years of noise inside it. Across the aisle sat my parents, no lawyer, just them. My father's jaw locked tight, my mother clutching a tissue she hadn't yet used. When the judge asked for their response, my father spoke first. "He chose to stay," he said. "He told us he wanted to be independent. We supported that." Evan stepped forward and placed a copy of the old social services form on the evidence table, the one listing only 3 family members. "The state file says otherwise," he said. "He was excluded from their household months before the move." The judge's pen paused. She looked up and said quietly, "Did you intentionally remove your son from this record?" My father said nothing. The silence answered for him. My mother began to cry, the kind of tears that come from exhaustion, not remorse. "We wanted him to grow up," she said. Evan Cho nodded politely, then connected his laptop to the screen. "Let's talk about these photos then." The courtroom lights dimmed. On the monitor appeared the smiling images she had sent me, the digital edits, the metadata visible in the corner, showing they'd been altered days before the email. "You attempted to rewrite history," Evan said, "not for healing, but for manipulation." The room went still, except for the sound of the heater. The judge asked one final question. "Why did you continue contacting him after being told to stop?" My father inhaled sharply, then said, "Because we need help. Financial help." The words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. The judge wrote them down verbatim. I felt my throat tighten, not with anger, but with something close to pity. Evan played the recorded call from Tacoma. My mother's voice filled the room. "If you bring family business to the police, there will be nothing left to talk about." No one moved. When the audio stopped, she pressed the tissue to her mouth. After a long moment, Judge Denise Harper spoke. "The court finds sufficient evidence of harassment, intimidation, and emotional endangerment." She signed the orders herself. 4 years of no contact, no visits, no third-party communication. She looked directly at my parents. "You do not own this narrative anymore. Family is not a weapon." When it was over, the room emptied in fragments. Reporters whispered near the door, but no one approached. My mother called my name once, called it softly, as if the sound itself might reverse time. I turned long enough to meet her eyes. For the first time, I felt nothing at all. No heat, no hate, just the blank space where love used to live. Outside, snow was beginning again, fine as dust. Evan stepped beside me, adjusting his scarf. "You did it," he said. I shook my head. "Nobody wins in something like this," I said. "We just stop losing." He smiled faintly. "That's still a kind of victory." Ryan and Nina joined us on the steps. The courthouse clock struck noon, echoing down the block. People passed by, oblivious to the history that had just shifted inside those walls. I looked up at the sky, the same pale gray it had been the day I found the first note on the kitchen counter. For the first time, the memory didn't hurt. It just existed. We walked to the parking lot in silence. Evan carried the file under his arm like a shield. At the car, Ryan hesitated. "What now?" he asked. "We start over," I said, "and this time we choose who gets to stay." As I drove away, the courthouse shrank in the rear-view mirror. Snowflakes drifted across the windshield, melting instantly. For years I'd believed closure would feel like light, but it was quieter than that. Just the steady hum of the road, the knowledge that no one was chasing anymore. When I reached the edge of the city, I pulled over to watch the clouds clear above the mountains. The air was cold and thin, the kind that makes you aware of every breath. I thought of Wichita, Kansas, the storage unit, the diner, the folding desk. I thought of the boy they'd left behind, and the man standing in his place. Back in Seattle that evening, I placed the court order on my kitchen counter beside the old note. 2 pieces of paper, one that tried to erase me, one that confirmed I existed. The contrast felt almost sacred. I poured a glass of water, watched the snow fall outside, and whispered to the empty room, "It's over." Evan Cho called once more before midnight. "They might appeal," he said, "but the evidence is airtight. Sleep." I thanked him and hung up. The apartment was quiet except for the low hum of the heater. For the first time in 13 years, I didn't check the locks twice. I sat by the window until the city lights blurred into the snow and whispered a sentence I'd carried too long. "You'll figure it out." And I had just not for them. I sent the email at midnight and slept better than I had in months. "Meet me once," I wrote. "After today, don't ever appear again." I didn't tell Evan or Ryan. This wasn't about strategy. It was about ending a habit that had lived in my bones since I was 18. Friday came bright and windless, the first warm morning of spring. The cafe on Fifth Avenue had wide front windows and old tables that remembered every cup placed on them. I chose the back corner with my shoulders to the wall and my eyes on the door. At 11:59, they stepped inside. My mother wore a wool sweater, even though the day didn't ask for it. My father's mouth was a straight line drawn too hard. I didn't stand. I gestured to the chairs. No handshakes, no pleasantries. I slid a manila folder across the table and kept my voice even. "Every email, every photo, every message you sent from new numbers after I asked you to stop. If you reach out to anyone in my family again, me, Ryan, and Nina, or their daughter Emma, I'll send this to every person who knows you, church neighbors, employers. Not because I want to humiliate you, but because I'm done being your secret." My father's palm cracked against the wood. "You're extorting your own parents." I didn't blink. "I'm protecting myself." He leaned back like the chair might break under him, eyes bright with the kind of anger that thinks it's love. My mother's fingers worried the edge of a napkin until it frayed. "We just don't want to die alone," she said, a small voice in a room that wasn't small at all. "That is a consequence of choices you made," I answered. "It's not a punishment I owe you to fix." I took out 2 sheets and laid them side by side. On the left, the original, "You'll figure it out." On the right, the echo she'd mailed last week, "You'll figure it out. We always knew you would. Now help us. Do you see it?" Same sentence. "New leash. The only difference is, I'm not your 18-year-old problem to solve anymore." My father laughed once, a sharp bark that made two people at the counter turn their heads. "You think you can erase blood?" "Blood is biology," I said. "Family is a choice." I placed my phone on the table and pressed play. The recording from Ryan's landline filled the space between us. My mother's voice cool and careful. "If you bring family business to the police, there will be nothing left to talk about." I stopped it at the click. "If I see that Buick anywhere near my building again, I won't just call the cops. I'll publish everything. Not threats. Promises." My mother reached across the table and gripped my hand like a ledge. "Please," she whispered, tears sudden and clean. "Please don't do this. We're trying." I didn't pull away and I didn't squeeze back. I met her eyes and said the truest thing I had. "I don't hate you. I just don't feel anything for you anymore." My father's mouth opened, then closed. The barista banged a porafilter against a trash can. A bus sighed to a stop outside and kept going. The light through the windows made the dust look like a soft storm. I stood first. My chair scraped wood. I left the folder there and took the two notes with me, original and echo past and present, in my breast pocket like two stones finally named behind me. My mother said my name soft and breaking at the middle. I didn't look back. The sun outside made my eyes sting. I walked until the cafe was a blur in the glass, and the city felt like it belonged to me again. That night in my journal I wrote a single line. "They told me to figure it out. Now I will figure out how never to be hurt by them again." 6 months passed like wind through pines. I moved to a small house in Bellingham where the mountains sit close enough to touch on clear days. The yard was a rectangle of scrub grass and stubborn dandelions, a kind of ordinary that felt like luxury. Ryan and Nina found a place a few blocks over with a swing set already bolted into the ground. Emma, who insisted on being called Sunny now because she'd decided she liked summer more than flowers, learned the route between our porches before I memorized it myself. Work changed shape. I ran Northline Consulting from a desk by the window. Mornings filled with quiet calls and dashboards that behaved afternoons with walks under a sky that didn't press on my chest. In the evenings, my house glowed. Sunny tore through the living room with a cape made from a dish towel. Nina stirred something that smelled like memory. Ryan brewed mint tea and leaned against the counter like he'd always belonged there. The old silence that used to sit in my kitchen was replaced by the clatter of forks and the soft chaos of people who expect to be welcome. On a new episode of the podcast, I said a thing I'd been circling for years. Sometimes peace doesn't require forgiveness. Sometimes it just requires you to stop apologizing to yourself for surviving. The episode traveled farther than I did. Messages poured in from strangers with familiar wounds. I read them on the porch as dusk slowed the street and felt less alone than I had at any point in my life. One morning, Evan Cho forwarded 2 envelopes that had been routed through his office. Handwritten, my mother's careful slope on both. I stood with them for a long time before I opened mine. There were no explanations, no bargains. "We were wrong," she wrote. "We hurt you. We understand why you don't want us in your life. May you be well." My chest didn't cave in. It didn't expand either. It just stayed steady and ordinary. I showed the letter to Ryan at my kitchen table. He unfolded his and found the same words. "Do you think they mean it?" he asked. "Maybe," I said. "But the truth is it doesn't matter. They don't get to change who we are anymore." He nodded, eyes on the paper like it might turn into something else if he stared hard enough. That night we celebrated Sunny's 4th birthday at my place because she wanted the sparkly lights I'd strung across the patio. Balloons bumped the ceiling. The grill smoked like a campfire. Friends came, and for the first time I felt what a house feels like when it's doing its job, holding people. Sonny climbed onto a chair to blow out the candles and forgot halfway through, which meant we lit them twice and laughed like we were getting away with something. After the guests left and the floor had been reclaimed from confetti, I found a scrap of paper under a plate. Crayon letters marched unevenly across it. "Uncle Ethan, you figured it out." I laughed at the kitchen counter, a sound without any sharp edges. The sentence that once cut me now sat in my hands, blunted and warm. I took the letter from my mother and the note from Sonny and put them in the same small wooden box, the same one that held the old kitchen note and the court order. On the lid, in black marker, I wrote, "Foreclosure, not memory." I slid the box onto the top shelf of the hall closet and closed the door. The next morning smelled like rain. I opened the windows and answered emails about inventory drift and warehouse slotting while sparrows argued on the fence. Around noon, Ryan knocked and let himself in. He asked already filling the kettle. We didn't talk about the past. We talked about a preschool fundraiser and which weekend the trail would be less crowded, and whether the tomatoes would survive a late freeze. It felt like we'd been practicing for this our whole lives without knowing it. Later, when the house was quiet again, I took the old note from my wallet and set it on the desk. The paper was almost as thin as tissue now, the ink ghosting from years of being folded and unfolded. I laid beside it a photo Sonny had drawn of a house with smoke curling from the chimney and 3 stick figures standing in the yard holding hands. Beneath it, she'd written our names and added a crooked heart. I looked at both for a long time, then put the note back where it belonged, kept but powerless. At sunset, the mountains went purple, and the clouds turned the color of peaches. I stood on the porch with a mug warming my hands and listened to the evening settle. Somewhere 2 blocks away, Sonny shouted my name and Ryan shouted back that dinner was in the oven, and I felt the circle close. Not the kind that traps you, the kind that keeps you. 13 years ago, they left a sentence on a counter and called it a plan. They were right about one thing. I did learn to take care of myself. Not by becoming what they wanted, but by no longer needing anything from them at all. I didn't plan on building a new life around quiet, but that's what happened. In Bellingham, the days opened like clean pages. The air smelled like something you could trust. I worked in the mornings, walked the neighborhood at lunch, and cooked enough dinner to make leftovers for Ryan when his meetings ran late. On Sundays, we traded houses without saying so. Whoever's porch had more shade got the company. From the outside, it would have looked ordinary. A kid's chalk drawings fading on the sidewalk. A grill that smoked too much. A stack of library books going back late. Inside, I could feel the tectonic plates of old habits shifting. I wasn't watching the door anymore. I wasn't building escape routes in my head. The first change I made was so small it almost felt silly. I took the broken watch from my drawer and brought it to a jeweler on Maple Street. He turned the crystal in a cloth like a priest and listened to the uneven tick. "It wants to run," he said, as if the watch had agency. Watch. When I picked it up a week later, the second hand moved like it had decided to keep going. I wore it on the days my mind tried to tell me that time could be rewound by regret. It couldn't. The second change happened because of a coincidence that didn't feel like one. A woman named Claire emailed after hearing the podcast. She signed the message with a last name I knew only from paperwork in a file box Adler. She was his daughter, the one whose name sat like a bruise in that old subject line. She wrote that she'd left home at 19, that by the time she felt steady enough to return, the silence had calcified. And then, years just kept happening. "I heard your voice," she wrote, and realized I still had mine. She wanted to talk to her father. She didn't want to call. She asked if I would sit with them if she came to Seattle. I called Mr. Adler at his office. The printer was running in the background. I could hear the soft rattle of paper when I told him he didn't speak for 10 seconds. Then he said, "Friday, Genuro. I'll make coffee." The meeting wasn't dramatic. It was two people who had learned how to live without each other trying to remember how to share a room. I sat on the far chair close enough to be anchor, far enough not to catch the undertow. He told her he had been stubborn and ashamed. She told him she had been stubborn and hurt. They didn't fix 13 years in an hour, but they did fix the part where they both pretended not to want to. When she left, she hugged me like a teammate rather than a savior. On the sidewalk outside the office, she said, "You don't have to carry us." I nodded and felt something loosen in my shoulders. Not every story needs me to be the hinge. After that, work stopped feeling like a bunker. I took on fewer clients and built them better. I built a small fund instead, a side project that took its name from the place where my life had changed shape, the Ledger Fund. Microgrants for kids thrown out of homes or left without one. $200 gets someone through a week. Sometimes a bus card and a prepaid phone and a padlock make a different outcome. I made the application short enough to fit on a phone screen and asked for no essays and no pity. Proof was simple. A photo of a bag you were living out of a screenshot of a text that ended a lease that was never in your name. Donations came from strangers who had slept on floors, from people who had been the kind adult in the room once, from businesses that wanted to turn their tax write-off into something with a pulse. I set rules I wish I'd had. We don't call parents. We believe you the first time. We never ask you to stand in line to prove you deserve help. Running the fund made the apartment lighter. The emails that used to bring me back into old rooms started bringing me forward. I answered questions about shelters and safeguards, about where to print documents for free, about how to open a bank account when your ID expired because there was no address to send a new one to. I taught 3 different kids how to build a budget on a free spreadsheet, and one of them sent me a photo of the emergency fund counter hitting $100 with the caption, "First time I've ever seen this number go up." On a Tuesday afternoon, Evan Cho called to tell me he'd heard from a church board in Tennessee. He had sent them the PDF of the newsletter my parents used to claim they were searching for a son they had made invisible, and asked for a correction to be made with the same energy as the original lie. "They want to speak directly," he said. "Do you want that? I didn't know." He patched them in anyway. The pastor sounded like a man who was used to speaking at hospital beds. He said he'd read the file. He'd listened to my podcast. He'd watched the hearing. We carried a story we didn't verify. He said, "We're going to make that right in front of the same people who heard it wrong." The next Sunday, they stood in front of their congregation and said the words out loud. A board member sent the recording to Evan Cho, and Evan sent it to me. I didn't watch it. I let it exist on my hard drive as proof that truth can travel the same roads. Lies do if someone insists on driving. Detective Jamie O'Neill closed a loop too. The building leak in Seattle had bothered me in a way that made sleep thin. Someone had told my parents about the flowers on my doormat before I could even throw them away. O'Neill found it in 3 days a temp security guard who had picked up extra shifts at my building and recognized my last name from a friend's church gossip chain. He'd taken a cash envelope from a man who drove an old Buick and made 2 phone calls he shouldn't have made. The building fired him. The DA declined to file charges that would stick, but we got a written statement and a promise to notify if he took any job in the network again. It wasn't vengeance, just friction against future harm. I learned to accept the kind of justice that looks like paperwork instead of lightning. Ryan started therapy with Dr. Megan Rhodes. He was the one who asked, not me. The first week, he said it felt like peeling sunburn. The second week, he came over after his session and sat on my floor with Sunny and built a ridiculous tower out of blocks until it leaned like a monument to imperfection. "I gave them my login," he said after she went to bed. "I never changed the password. I wanted to be the good son. That's how they got the money." He looked at me like he expected a verdict. I didn't give him one. "What matters," I said, "is what password you changed today." He laughed and cried in the same breath. We wrote new passwords together, long strings of nonsense no one would guess, and he saved them in a vault like artifacts. We took the account off his father's old contact list. Sometimes healing is just logistics. There were still aftershocks. A cousin I barely remembered sent a Facebook message that started with my name and ended with a Bible verse. I didn't answer. A woman from the old neighborhood tracked down my work email to tell me that my mother had been different lately, more quiet, more kind. I said, "Thank you," and left it on read. The restraining order sat between us like a clean pane of glass. It didn't fix a relationship. It defined a perimeter. I could live with that. The old gas station on I-10 haunted me in ways that made no sense. It had been a detail almost lost in the paper dust of the first night. That faint blot of ink on the back of a note, the proof that they had filled the car and left while I was slinging pancakes under a fluorescent buzz. One morning in early summer, I drove south without telling anyone why. The highway unfurled the way it always does when you let it, and I let it. I found the exit by memory and inevitability. The gas station had a new sign and half the pumps were out of order. Inside, a teenager with headphones took cash and didn't look up. I walked the aisles and bought gum and a bottle of water just to stand where the past had once been present. There was nothing to find. Of course there wasn't. Footage doesn't live for 13 years. Witnesses don't carry other people's moments on their backs. Still, there was something like relief in the emptiness. The universe had left no shrine at the sight of my leaving. That meant I didn't have to either. On the way back, I stopped at the storage facility in Wichita because the car seemed to know the way without me. The steel doors were the same dull blue. The office smelled like cherry air freshener and warm dust. The clerk wasn't the same man, but he had the same way of looking at you like he already knew where you belonged. I rented a unit for one day, rolled up the door, and sat cross-legged on the clean concrete. I timed my breathing with the hollow quiet. I said thank you out loud into the echo, and heard myself mean it. Another part of the story I hadn't told anyone was the neighbor girl from the old apartment, Sophia, who used to practice clarinet in the stairwell because her mother worked nights and the noise in their place made practice impossible. We'd shared instant noodles and a space heater under a blanket when the heat got cut. She had moved away before I did. I found her on the internet without trying, a music teacher in Flagstaff, now hair longer, eyes the same. I wrote, "Do you remember the train horns?" She wrote, "I still hear them in my head when I need a metronome." We didn't make plans to see each other. We let the knowing of each other exist like a kindness unmixed with obligation. At home, Sonny discovered that the sun makes small rainbows on the hallway wall when it hits my grandmother's cracked glass bowl just right. Every day at 5:14, she would stand in the doorway and yell for me to come see as if it were a show I might miss. One evening, the bowl shifted in the sink and broke into 2 pieces. I expected tears. She picked up the larger shard and held it to the window, rainbows blooming across her face. "It still works?" she said, delighted. I wrote that down later and underlined it twice. The letters from my parents didn't stop. They changed shape. Every few months, a plain envelope would arrive at Evan Cho's office forwarded to mine with a sticky note that said, "Your call." The contents were simple, brief updates written like weather reports. "We're in counseling. We moved to a smaller place. We're working. We hope you are well." No invitations, no demands. Sometimes I read them. Sometimes I put them in the box without opening them and labeled the month on the corner so I didn't have to read to keep a record. Healing doesn't need to be performative to be real. One afternoon in July, a boy came by the Ledger Fund office with a backpack that looked like it had been designed for a different kind of life. He had the posture of someone who expected to be turned away. His name was Malik. He was 19. He had been sleeping in a friend's car in a gym parking lot because the friend's parents didn't know he was there. He wanted to get to Tucson. His aunt had a couch there and a promise she'd kept so far. He needed money for gas, a phone that didn't die after 10 minutes, and a map that didn't lie. We gave him what he asked for. He wrote his first budget on the whiteboard, and I watched his shoulders come down as if information itself were a form of shelter. Before he left, he looked at the wall where I kept a framed copy of the restraining order, not because I liked it, but because it reminded me that boundaries are documents sometimes. "Is that yours?" he asked. "It was," I said. "It kept me safe while I learned other ways too." He nodded the way people do when you've handed them a tool they can't use yet, but might someday. Not every note I sat down stayed where I placed it. There were days when hunger returned in its old costume restlessness, a need to pick at something that wasn't there. On those days, I walked farther than I needed to and cooked for more people than I had promised. I texted Sam from the diner and sent him a photo of a badly flipped pancake to prove I hadn't lost all my moves. He sent back a photo of his new dishwasher, a kid with bad bangs and a grin that looked like mine used to, and wrote, "Still paying cash under the table until he gets his papers." I wrote, "Pay him for 25 minutes to nap." He wrote, "Always." And if this were a movie, this would be the part where a new love interest appears, light bouncing off a glass of water just so, and the old house learns a new language. Life gave me something simpler. A neighbor named Erin knocked to ask if my porch light timer was broken because it came on too early and kept her toddler awake. She wore a sweatshirt with paint on the cuffs and apologized 3 times for knocking. We fixed the timer and then fixed a leaky hose bib, and then traded numbers for emergencies we never used. She told me she'd gone back to school at 32 because she wanted to draw buildings for a living. I told her I kept my job because people systems were more interesting than empty ones. Some afternoons we walked the block and didn't pretend the last decade of our lives had been clean. We didn't make promises. We decided to be neighbors on purpose. It was enough. The only thing that still felt like a loaded wire was the video I didn't watch the church apology. One night in late summer, I poured tea and set the laptop on the table and pressed play. The sanctuary was full of the same light I remembered from childhood churches in other towns, soft and forgiving. The pastor spoke without drama. He named the harm and the lie and the correction. My parents were not on camera. The choir hummed something under their breath at the end, and I closed the window before the final amen. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt like a room had been righted after a long tilt. That was enough. Before the first snow, I drove to a thrift store and bought a battered Formica table, the same off-white with gray flecks as the one that had held the note. Ryan helped me carry it in. We set it under the kitchen window. "You sure?" he asked. "You want to look at that every day." I ran my hand over the surface over the next time I'd already made. "I want to write on it," I said. We used it for homework and grocery lists, and to assemble a toy dinosaur that refused to keep its tail on. On the first morning it was in the house, the sunlight hit the edge just so, and I watched the shadow of my hand pass over it like a small weather system I controlled. I made a rule I didn't tell anyone. If a new note ever sat on that table again, it would be one I left for myself, and it would tell the truth. I used to think the ending of this story would be a bang, a clean courtroom victory, a hard-edged confrontation, a door slamming shut, and silence swallowing everything. Real life doesn't close with fireworks. It lands softly like snow settling on a windowsill, like the whistle of a kettle in a new kitchen, like the steady breathing of a child napping on your couch. I spent years chasing a final period. What I found instead was a daily choice. I will not live under fear or under the invisible debt called blood. If you've walked with me this far, you already know the big shards of glass, the note on the counter, the nights curled up in a storage unit, the grease-stained shifts the company built on a folding desk and spreadsheets, the thin air of Seattle, the email that arrived the same week my bank app turned to 7 digits, the pried-open door in Tacoma, the quiet courtroom where a judge's pen remade the rules, the last coffee where the cup never had time to cool. But there are smaller pieces I haven't lingered on: how I practiced breathing when the doorbell rang. The texts I typed and deleted come up if you want, then didn't send the nights. I wondered if I'd grown too hard. In the mornings, I realized hardness is sometimes just another word for kindness toward yourself. People ask me a lot, have you forgiven them? Will you give them another chance? I used to believe forgiveness was the only finish line. Now I know forgiveness is a right, not an obligation. You can choose peace without reopening the door that cut you. You can place a parent's apology letter next to a child's crayon note that says, "You figured it out," and smile not because you forgot, but because you're finally safe enough to remember. You can call people family not because they share your DNA, but because they honor your limits and arrive without demanding anything. If this story carries one message, it's this: boundaries aren't walls, they're doorways. People who respect them walk through. People who don't can wait outside. I wish someone had told 18-year-old me that. I wish someone had pulled me out of the guilt pit others had dug and taught me that helping never equals moving back into the fire. You never have to prove you deserve love by enduring more harm, no matter what mask that harm wears, even if it's the mask of family. To anyone hearing this who recognizes themselves, I don't know your address, but I know the feeling of being lost in your own home. I know the quiet when no one calls for years and the heaviness when the phone starts ringing again. I know the shake in your hand when you sign for a restraining order and the strange relief when a doorman says, "We turned them away." I know the awkwardness of your first chosen family dinner food, two salty stories breaking mid-sentence, and the moment you look up and realize laughter has bridged every gap. I'm not here to tell you whether to sue or forgive. I'm here to encourage what keeps you safe. Your body, your apartment, your mind. Document everything. Save the emails. Screenshot. Keep the flower card. Timestamp calls. Paper is the language the system speaks. And sometimes you need the system on your side. If you can see a therapist, if you can't talk to a friend who believes you write simple rules and mean them. No money, no loans, no private meetings, no secrets. You'll be surprised how much lighter life feels when your boundaries are sentences you can say out loud. And to anyone on the other side of the boundary, if you've harmed your child, the best knock isn't on their door, it's on your own heart. Apologize without conditions. Get help. Fix what can be fixed. Accept what can't. And don't ask someone else to pay so you can feel better. Love isn't dragging someone back with the fear of abandonment. Love is making sure they're safe, whether or not they ever come back. When I set the wooden box on the closet shelf, holding the old kitchen note, the court order, my mother's last letter, and Sonny's crooked crayon line, I knew I was performing a ritual. Not worshiping the past, but sealing it. The box can be opened, but it isn't required for today's happiness. Happiness turns out to be plain and generous. A drizzly evening, a kettle singing Small Shoes racing down a hall, my brother Ryan making a dumb joke that breaks the table into laughter, and the freedom not to explain to anyone why some people aren't invited. If this story helped you in any way, I'm asking something small that might help someone else. Leave a simple hi or listening in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. That tiny sign of presence tells another person they aren't alone. If this resonates, please subscribe. It matters more than you think, and it lets us keep building episodes about boundaries, about subtle patterns of abuse, about constructing a chosen family, and about practical skills. How to keep records, how to work with an attorney, how to say no without your hands shaking. Share this with someone standing at the edge. One click can change a whole year. If you have your own story unfinished or complete, I invite you to tell it. Send it to me or just write a few lines. I survived by. I can't promise the perfect answer, but I can promise to read to honor and to ask the most important question with you. What keeps you safe today? From there we can begin. I'm not a hero. I'm just a kid who was left behind and decided not to leave myself again. I didn't beat anyone. I stopped losing. I didn't build walls. I installed doors. I didn't erase the past. I learned to put it in a box. And when I hear Sonny mispronounce my name as Zeffy and laugh like the kitchen might crack, I understand the ending I'd been chasing wasn't punishment for anyone. It was permission for me. If someone ever leaves a cold note on your counter, remember, you don't have to prove you're worthy of love. Step out of the burning house. Take a long breath. Name the people who will walk beside you and write a new sentence. I wrote mine. I hope you'll write yours. When you're ready, I'll be here listening. Thank you for staying with me to the last page. If this helped, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so that when another person stands up to set a boundary, you can be the first one there. A hand on their shoulder saying, "I'm here. I hear you." And now your part begins.